I'm gonna let everybody in and we can chill out for a little bit and then we'll get started maybe in a couple minutes. Okay. We are recording. Captioners are here and ready. One thing I haven't figured out yet is playing music before an event when we let people in. Yeah. All right, here we go. Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or so. Welcome. All right, let's get started. Good afternoon to everyone joining us from near and far. My name is Amy Powell, and I'm curator of modern and contemporary art here at Krannert Art Museum at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to host Dr. Lex Lancaster for their talk, Queer Abstraction, Dragging Difficult Histories. As we begin, I invite you to acknowledge and to work beyond land acknowledgement of the Indigenous presences and nations whose land you occupy, wherever that might be. Krannert Art Museum, as part of the University of Illinois, stands on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these indigenous nations prior to their forced removal, and they continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity today. As part of a land grant institution dedicated to promoting the critical power of art of the past and present, Krannert Art Museum has a responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this university over the last 150 years. We also recognize the particular role images have played in this history. Using our collections, programming, and collaborative relationships, we seek to address and reflect on these histories and the role that the U of I continues to play in shaping them. We host Lex Lancaster today alongside the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the Program in Art History, and the LGBT Resource Center. I want to offer huge thanks to my stellar colleagues in these departments and all that you're doing for students and intellectual engagement amidst these times of overlapping pandemics. Support for Dr. Lancaster's visit comes from the Humanities Research Institute Supplemental Event Fund and the student cultural programming fee. And we're grateful for this support. Special thanks to Decaden Henningsen, Meanwhile Letterpress, and Ollie Greer for having us in your spaces today. So tremendously inspiring, both of these artists and folks making good work and good community here in Champaign-Urbana. So we're much appreciative of these visits. Before I introduce Lex, please note that there are still spots available for our in-person workshop tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. inside the Louise Fishman exhibition here at CAM. The workshop is titled Abstract Tactics, Queer, Black, and Trans Approaches to the Problem of Visuality. If you would like to join us safely in person, please email me this evening. That's alpowell@illinois.edu. I will put that in the chat to receive the workshop readings. Undergraduate students, please join us in the LGBT Resource Center for a Zoom lunch with Lex on Friday at noon. You can register online at cam.illinois.edu/events to receive the Zoom link. I will also put that in the chat. During this lunch, we'll be talking more casually about Lex's research and career interests in queer art, art history, and curating. Looking forward to that very much. And now to introduce. For those of us who are not artists, but who endeavor to think with them by curating their work, by writing about it, by ensuring deep contextualization and sustained engagement, thinking about abstraction and all the ways that art works on us can be a considerable challenge. Lex Lancaster's work is an incredible model and a map for how to do art history at its very best. They take seriously and write so beautifully about the full intersections of contemporary art's materiality and formalism alongside its political investments. They make clear what is at stake. A given work, in Lex's account, can change you and possibly dissolve you, whether through hard edges, grids, brilliant colors, spatial tactics, and glitches. Such formal interventions become queer processes in Lex's work that affect transformation if we let them, not only in the institutions where we work and in the canons of art history we receive, but that by centering anti-racist, queer feminist practice, we find kinship and community in such unsettlements. This is exactly why I wanted to invite Lex and their work to be in conversation with the exhibition, A Question of Emphasis, Louise Fishman drawing. That exhibition is up here through February 26th. So if you're local or close by, please definitely come see in these cold months. Lex Morgan Lancaster is a scholar, professor, and curator who focuses on queer, feminist, trans, and anti-racist visual and theoretical contributions to the field of contemporary art. They've published essays in the journals Discourse and ASAP Journal, and forthcoming in the exhibition catalog for Linda Bessemer, this exhibition that's going to open at Clearfield Contemporary next month. Along with their book forthcoming this fall from Duke University Press, titled Dragging Away, Queer Abstraction in Contemporary Art, their work investigates the phenomenon of queer abstraction, forging a queer, formalist, and materialist approach to the history of abstraction and its persistence in contemporary art. Dr. Lancaster is assistant professor of art history and gallery director at the University of South Carolina Upstate, and a kin comrade in the House of Kazed. With gratitude and anticipation, I turn things over to Lex for their lecture, Queer Abstraction, Dragging Difficult Histories.
Thank you so much, Amy. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, thanks to Amy for inviting me and for the opportunity to think with her marvelous exhibition of Louise Fishman's work. Amy is someone I've admired for a long time, and I'm honored to be in conversation and community with her. It's been a wonderful visit. So I have several aims for my talk today. First, I want to introduce the term queer abstraction and consider what's at stake in taking abstraction seriously as a queer tactic in art. I'll discuss some examples from my book to demonstrate how I see abstraction operating queerly. And finally, I'll consider Louise Fishman's work in light of all this. So queer abstraction can be considered a movement in contemporary art practice, as many queer artists and those who are invested in politics of gender, sexuality, and race are utilizing abstract, formal, and material strategies rather than figural representation. To begin, queer abstraction defies some of the expectations we bring to queer art and how we think queering happens. One important way into the topic of queer abstraction for me is to think with queer feminist art practices that exploded in the early 90s in the wake of the AIDS crisis and the culture wars. The art collective Fierce Pussy, as you see here, used very direct language and found images to generate queer feminist politics. The term queer art often conjures images of people, eroticism, and communities. We imagine figures and bodies. This field has been defined by representation, and photography and performance, for example, have been so important for queer art practices. Through strategic visibility politics and agitprop tactics, queer artists have fought for rights and recognition in the public sphere. Fierce Pussy wheat pasted these Xerox posters all over New York City, reclaiming the language used for anti-queer violence. These pejoratives may abstract people into concepts, like dykes, but Fierce Pussy reroutes that violence, the violence of that abstraction, toward a language of pleasure and even pride. These words still have the potential to harm, but the terms are made tenuous through their exposure and repetition. Abstraction can alter the terms and images we take for granted by exposing their contingency. The relationship between the work and everything going on outside of the work that we might use to determine its meaning becomes obviously precarious. This strategy for taking on and torquing the forms that have harmed, forms that are seemingly not for us as queers, aligns with the difficult operations of abstraction that I elucidate in my book. The four core members of Fierce Pussy, Joy Episala, Carrie Yamaoka, Zoe Leonard, and Nancy Brooks Brody, all utilize visual and material strategies of abstraction in their work. And all of their work has appeared together in an ongoing series of exhibition chapters curated by Joey Tang, Fierce Pussy Amplified, which has really helped me to make these connections with their work. For example, Episala's photograms are sheets of photographic paper on a monumental scale with cracks and ripples from handling and exposure. Yamaoka's work is reflective polyester film cast in urethane resin to create a kind of warped mirror that continues to change and develop and always implicates the viewer in our own gazing. What do we make of these practices, the work of politically engaged queer feminist artists that defies the expectation that they should transparently represent themselves in their work, and instead pursues formal and material invention as unlikely vehicles for political engagement? How can work that does not directly represent a figure or a body operate queerly? What queer possibilities beyond the representational does this work open up for us? Queer is generally understood to describe non-normative sexualities, identities, and communities. But the term, my use of the term, as you have probably already gathered, is more in line with queer theory's understanding of queer as a verb that works as an active challenge to norms of gender and sex. So I'm thinking frequently with scholars like Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, Jose Munoz, Sarah Ahmed, scholars who've helped us to imagine what queer can do beyond a singular identity to engage us more affectively and relationally. Rather than attach queer to a subject matter, I'm asking how this artwork queers by challenging the stability of representation itself, and challenges us in other ways, as they often prompt intimate encounters, demanding a certain vulnerability on our part. Accordingly, my understanding of queer abstraction isn't about the artist's identities. My methods are not biographical, but it does proceed from an awareness of their artistic practices and political investments, considering their work can operate beyond their own positions and continue to circulate in multiple contexts. On the one hand, I'm asking how and why abstraction is useful for queer and politically engaged artists. On the other, I argue that abstraction queers through visual and material tactics that actively defy legibility. This refusal of direct representation is precisely why abstraction is politically relevant. It refuses the surveilling demand that we appear as expected in the form of predetermined categories, and shows that queering can operate as aesthetic innovation and a politics of form and materiality. There are varying approaches to the topic of abstraction as it relates to queer politics as well as trans politics. I won't deal with the tension between them here. That's something that is addressed in my book. David Goetze has made significant contributions at this intersection. Some previous scholarship tends to view abstraction in the work of queer artists as either a kind of closet or a glossing over of difference, or as a coded representation or reference to a body, like reading certain curves as feminine or reading certain body parts into the work. I'm arguing against the tendency to read this work iconographically, as though we must always have the figure or the body show up somehow in any queer or trans work, and instead to take abstraction seriously as abstraction rather than reduce it to something categorically legible. My work forges a queer formalist and materialist approach as a core methodological intervention to expand our understanding of how queering works. There are more examples of artists who produce overtly queer representational work, but who also produce total abstractions. Carrie Moyer is an example of this, a founding member of Dyke Action Machine. I'm not saying that these artists' practices progress from representation to abstraction. I'm saying that these practices actually defy an easy opposition between abstraction and representation, even as I'm making a case for how abstraction can be politically useful in light of the fact that visual representation can be problematic. I'm never arguing that we should do away with representation or the figure. We have to use all the strategies and forms available to us if we are to imagine queer futures and materialize more just worlds. Another way into the topic of queer abstraction is via the 1970s work of lesbian feminist artists like Harmony Hammond and, of course, Louise Fishman, pioneers of queer abstraction before we had the words. If we were going to trace a genealogy of queer abstraction, I would contend that Dyke practices are central. Also thinking about abstraction as an anti-racist tactic, the work of Black feminist artists such as Howardina Pindell or Singa Ngugi are also central to this genealogy of abstraction as a political art-making strategy. My understanding of the gendered and racial politics of abstraction has been shaped by the work of Black feminist and queer artists and is indebted to the scholarship on Black abstraction by Adrienne Edwards, for example. So how does abstraction resonate socially and politically if what we are seeing and feeling cannot be described in representational terms? How can such illegibility make other kinds of things, if not legible, then felt, palpable in more haptic and intimate ways? What are the benefits and risks of this? I'll take you through some core examples from the book, which is organized around formal and material strategies. And the two I'm going to discuss here are forms of geometric abstraction, the hard edge and the grid. I understand queer abstraction not as a stable image or style, but as visual and material processes that challenge direct representation. I use drag to describe these fugitive processes. The book's title is Dragging Away, taken from the origin of the term abstract from the Latin meaning to draw, pull, or drag away. Queer abstraction drags in multiple aesthetic, material, historical, and political ways as a pulling force or friction that impedes or obstructs, a temporal slowing down, a performative troubling of surface categories, a resistance and a difficult labor. I use dragging to describe how abstraction undermines normative reading practices, which tend to depend on categorizing according to stable notions of difference. In this, I am expanding particular queer theories of drag. I use Elizabeth Freeman's concept of temporal drag, the pull of the past on the present, to argue that this work drags on certain loaded modernist forms, like the hard edge. Drag is also a performative recitation. So thinking with Judith Butler, it does not just recreate, but make something new and altered in the process. As a political action of willful withdrawal, abstraction drags away by both taking up and pressing against the norms determined by the two-gender system, racism, and heteronormativity. And in that, I'm thinking with Renata Lorenz's concept of drag. So to investigate these multiple operations of drag, my book stages transhistorical conversations between contemporary works and certain modernist forms of modernist abstraction that they recite and reimagine, not as intentional appropriations necessarily, but more with a reckoning with a burdened historical language of these abstract forms. So this is one conversation between the work of Nancy Brooks Brody and the shaped monochrome canvases of Ellsworth Kelly, a post-war artist whose major interventions were hard edge and color field painting. So I consider how Brody's color forms queer geometric abstraction, and particularly the form of the hard edge. But I'm also reckoning with the difficulty of queer abstraction, which drags on the harmful histories of the forms that it uses, forging new possibilities while not letting go or disavowing that difficulty. And in that, I'm thinking with Jose Munoz and the concept of disidentification. To queer abstraction is in part to expose and reroute its power from a neutralizing and potentially violent erasure to a method for refusing fixity and materializing difference in unexpected ways. I couldn't investigate the form of the hard edge in Brody's work, for example, without considering all of its historical baggage and how that gets carried into the present. So the hard edge has historically worked as an essential design element in early 20th century art, an industrial, democratic aesthetic strategy. The hardened borders of geometric form were thought to be neutral and objective, so they could speak to modern forms of social organization and even revolutionary politics. Works like Moholy-Nagy's were considered radical because they shattered pictorial conventions of art and used abstraction to prove that art could be socially useful. That was their utopian ambition. The hard edge painting of the 1960s, exemplified by Kelly, were similarly preoccupied with the mechanical and seemingly impersonal manufacture of objects, clean lines and surfaces that were undisrupted by expressive gesture. This is to say that modernist geometry and the hard edge, as they were deployed specifically in European and US contexts, are attached to particular cultural and art historical ideals, along with some useful baggage that are reimagined in queer abstraction. How and why would these seemingly outdated aesthetics be useful for queer artists today, long after their utopian ambitions have been abandoned? We can see how Brody's color fields drag on these aesthetics, engaging with the way that Kelly's shaped canvases interact with the pristine white gallery wall, and more importantly, with the viewer. Brody's are enamel paintings embedded into gallery walls, and they're very small. I could hold them in my hand. There are several arguments I make about how the hard edge works and drags queerly, but here I want to focus on how this work both shores up and exceeds the bounds of a signifying logic, or the way a subject might be fixed and oppressed by categorical boundaries. With Kelly especially, I reckon with some of the ways that abstract forms are interpreted as signs. Kelly's work has often been discussed according to a signifying logic, as abstracted images transferred from natural or architectural forms. Brody's color forms might similarly prompt us to question the relationship between the abstract and the figurative. Wild combination is based on memories of people. The shapes are impressions, as Brody calls them, of the form that someone occupies in her mind, though always an imprecise, ephemeral form. It might seem that both works are abstracted references to real bodies and edges in the world. At the same time, this work doesn't define solidified figures, but instead produces a wavering or an uncontained movement on the peripheries. Brody's lines are never straight, and even the convex curves of Kelly's canvases prompt a dynamic movement. They start to kind of look like they're going to roll along the wall. I describe these as transitional objects. They expand into the world beyond themselves and yet maintain certain associations contingent on their surroundings and viewers. Brody's process seems to abstract a person, referencing abstraction's potential for erasure, but these works are never impersonal nor finite. Rather than read them as figurative references or signs, we can make more space for the contingency of unruly material encounters that drag away from an easy signification. The danger of a signifying logic has a particular relation to geometry. Think of the pink triangle, once used as a sign of stigma to mark queers for death. A symbol used to mark a subject as an abstraction can do harm, but it has also been redeployed in the service of queer politics by ACT UP to hold onto that harm while also converting its power for collective action to raise awareness and fight the stigma of AIDS. Queer abstraction is ambivalent. It has mixed feelings in that it holds on to the difficulty of the form that it redeploys while reimagining them in the service of alternative futures. These are smartphone images I took of Brody's work, exhibited in the 5th chapter of that exhibition series of Fierce Pussy's work, curated by Joey Tang. These might help you see more clearly what that encounter looks like from far away and up close. In work like Brody's, we feel the drag of abstract forms that are never really neutral or transcendent. Geometry might geometry might not be an outdated utopian strategy after all. Its critique of representational pictorial convention is still useful. Encountering Brody's work doesn't involve a reading of edges as bodily contours. You wouldn't engage with them at the scale of a body because of their intimate size. Rather, we imagine how they might feel to touch. The visceral contact between warm skin and a cool, hardened surface that seems like it might still be fluid. They shine, their surfaces undulate. The line of contact between the enamel support and the white sheetrock produces a palpable tension. The objects never quite fit. If there's a body involved in this encounter, it's not one that is represented, but my own immediate presence. I begin to feel precarious in relation to my surroundings, my boundaries as insecure as these color forms that still look wet and threaten to flow out over their borders. While Brody's have the formal austerity of hard edge painting, they also insist on the handcrafted imprecisions and haptic fluidity that elicit queer sensibilities. Brody's edging suggests an eroticism and a practice of care through close attention to boundaries, carefully etching into the gallery wall to make space for these small objects. They're embedded materially in the way that form can become embedded in memory, while also taking on the uncertainty and the contingency of that impression. This intimate encounter produces a relationality that is queer and also unspecified. Their boundaries don't fix a figure, but suggest that figure and ground mutually shape one another. The ways in which subjects orient and are oriented by their environment. Our viewing position will also affect their relationships, whether they move closer or touch or change in the shape of our vision. This ambiguity of perception also refuses to settle into a sign. I see them as focused more on the affective encounter. The figure ground relationship in painting typically presents a perceptual dichotomy of tension where we could only focus on one form or the other. Kelly's shaped canvases are both figure and ground. In one, we could also read the canvases as figures against the ground of the wall. Brodie's objects relate similarly to the wall, but because they're embedded into their ground, they also become part of it as a material intervention. Kelly's objects are so large that they take over the wall. Brodie's subtly become the wall, the very architecture, merging figure with ground without succumbing to it. They occupy the same plane and yet don't settle there, oscillating through wavering line and undulating surface to produce a push-pull in our vision. I think of the strategic figure-ground relationship in terms of how bodies are differentiated in the social field, made to mean through already existing codes of gender, sexuality, and race. Systems that make the body cohere according to predetermined signs still persist when abstract forms are read as code for a particular body. But the destabilization of boundaries between edge and plane renders the sign precarious. Forms in Brodie's work are not so easily extracted, differentiated, decoded. The edging lines of these enamel paintings drag away from the containment of border lines by which the hardness of geometric abstraction might otherwise be understood, using the hard edge as a form that can once divide or mark and insist on a margin that drags away and opens up to indeterminacy. I think these works can still prompt a queer eroticism and edging without settling into bodily legibility. They demand more intimate forms of spectatorship, rooted unexpectedly through formalism. The particular geometry of the triangle is also deployed by Every Ocean Hughes, who draws on its resonance with past collective movements and potential for edging toward imagined futures. Beyond the will to measure is a row of royal blue ceramic triangles, inverted with the top line of each triangle forming the edges of a continuous wave. It produces a traveling edge, not a straight line, but an undulating pattern that dips and peaks. The porcelain surfaces of this form produce a similar effect to Brodie's enamels. They're slick and shining. They are synchronized clocks and might perhaps evoke Felix Gonzalez Torres's clocks, but instead of a couple, they create a collectivity and insist on that form of the triangle as a vehicle for movement. Hughes writes, how can we build a structure to be alive inside? Toward a building of space and commons that privileges movement and margins, end quote. The series of wave triangle clocks adds to the triangle sign a sense of movement, perhaps how a movement sustains over time and makes waves. It reimagines the triangle marked by stigma to demonstrate its reparative potential, to refuse measurement and incite movement on the margins. Now I want to pivot slightly and talk about the grid, another form of geometric, another kind of geometric system that's been used to mark bodies according to predetermined codes. I've written about Lorna Simpson's Public Sex series, these large photographs printed on thick felt panels, to argue that the grid can both shore up technologies of bodily surveillance while also creating intimate vectors for queer relationality and for exceeding the grid's own oppressive logic. The grid is also an iconic form of modernism, a structure that mapped the literal surface of the canvas, as in the painting of Agnes Martin, and also claimed the kind of purity and universality that is associated with geometric abstraction more broadly. The grid has a complex history, and Simpson's work notably combines photography with gridded systems that have historically produced oppressive taxonomies. They recall the photographic documents used to justify eugenics in the 19th and early 20th century, often by placing physical types together in these grid patterns to evoke comparison and to produce certain bodies as raced and deviant. There is a danger in this form of the grid that fixes and regulates its subjects. It is a structure that makes bodies hyper visible and legible as other. Lorna Simpson's work also exemplifies by more expansive understanding of queer abstraction, which is not necessarily always produced by queer artists and is not necessarily non-representational. Simpson's practice contributes to contestatory gender and sexual politics, and her work often invokes queer content, as you'll see in this example. So this is a photograph of a city park at night, blown up and screen printed onto a large grid of 6 felt panels. It measures about 5.5 feet on either side, so we could almost walk into the scene, but our perspective is destabilized as we look down through the small forest of trees at a clearing of grass and a walking path. Rows of buildings create an expansive grid of windows that echoes the larger gridded structure. And the image is flanked by 2 narratives printed on felt panels. To the left, it reads, "Just unpacked a new shiny silver telescope, and we are up high enough for a really good view of all the buildings and the park." The living room window seems to be the best spot for it. On the sidewalk below, a man watches figures from across the path. And on the right, it is early evening. The lone sociologist walks through the park to observe private acts in the men's public bathrooms. These facilities are men's and women's rooms back to back. He focuses on the layout of the men's room, right to left, basin, urinal, 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 stall, stall. He decides to adopt the role of voyeur to look out in order to go unnoticed and noticed at the same time. His research takes several years. He names his subjects A, B, C, X, Y, and O, records their activities for now and their license plates when applicable for later. This is one work in Simpson's public sex series, where pictures of uninhabited places become the implied locations of sexual and voyeuristic acts described in narrative texts, but which we never see. In the context of the park, the grid enables certain forms of relationality that I understand to do queer work. Relationality refers to a being in common with others or a kind of affinity that moves beyond the individual subject, as articulated by Jean-Luc Nancy. And this contact across the bounds of difference is what Jose Munoz calls incommensurate, as it is incalculable and excessive, but also shared. This is a particular queer form of relationality that allows us to be in common in difference. And I consider the crisscrossing lines of the grid to create that kind of relational space of both commons and separation. This felt grid becomes a cruising site for what remains unrepresented and unresolved, yet shared or public through imaginative projections and events in which we, the spectator, are implicated. The text points to what is not seen in the image, but what still tempts and teases us with indirect reference to intimacy. Not only do the narratives of the park reference the gay cruising sites of public parks and men's restrooms and the voyeurs who observe them, but the gridded image further references the grid's ambivalent capacity for both surveillance and association, made sensual through the texture of felt. It refers to and disallows the gaze that fixes certain subjects as other, but it keeps the eroticism of the grid in play, or I should say it activates the eroticism of the grid, especially through the particular materiality of felt. Unlike a canvas, which is a gridded textile, felt is made of compressed fibers that interact more randomly. Felt evokes both a tactile sense of touch and an affective sensation, a feeling. This materially produces a picture plane that's not the ground of representation, but becomes a bushy and unruly site of contact. This is one way in which it refuses the force of the grid to settle bodies and spaces, and instead uses the felt to connect affect with materiality and produce relational textures of feeling. I put Simpson's grids in contact with Agnes Martin's painting to consider the excessive capacities of the grid, their capacity to exceed the force of surveilling logic. These two are close in scale, large and looming at about 6 feet. They relate directly to the body of the viewer as a landscape one could enter. At the same time, their gridded surfaces bar us from getting too caught up in illusory depth. They call attention to their surface as material planes on which picture is both rendered and abstracted. Like Simpson's titles, Martin's tend to reference landscape or nature, yet they create a boundless geography of coordinates that exceed two-dimensional mapping. If we pay attention to how the lines of the grid extend infinitely in space and suggest an infinite temporality, something that scholars of modernism have said of Martin's grids, the excessive material dimensions of Simpson's felt and Martin's repetitive patterns, and the vibratory effects of figure ground oscillation troubles a settled reference, or even a settled point of reference. The titles seem to specify what the picture cannot secure, and the grid is shown to exceed itself, even as it holds on to a potential surveilling power. It can make space for other things to happen. In both works, the grid emerges as an emphatically sensual form, and its textures can disrupt its regularity or cold austerity in favor of a more touchy-feely abstraction. The grid is not simply a background framework, but is rather an active, materializing force. Throughout my book, the materiality of the work is central to my understanding of its queer potential. A material dragging of the grid can also be seen in Linda Bessemer's acrylic paint sculpture. This is one of the artist's folds, where acrylic paint is dragged off of its canvas support and folded over a rod, hanging like a textile. Bessemer's work features in my chapter on color, considering how paint as a colored matter can be used to refuse the notion that the surface of the body will reveal the truth of race, gender, or sex. Rather than settling some notion of authentic skin, the dizzying patterns of their work destabilizes our perception. And I love this title, Baroqueasy. Bessemer's work delights in synthetic color and surface play, and also in perverting the grid, as the artist puts it, to use it against the grain of representation. Now, while color, along with pattern, is arguably the expressive element here, in Louise Fishman's paintings, it's all about gesture. The only way I know how to describe her chromatic play is dirty. Not just the smudging, but the browns and the grays and the muddying of color that is never pure. Fishman's work, I don't discuss Fishman's work in my book, but I've had the opportunity to think with her work in reviewing the exhibition catalog that Amy Powell edited as part of her exhibition. So my thoughts on the queer, relational, and excessive capacities of the grid in Fishman's work specifically have evolved in conversation with those essays. I was struck by the particular way the grid shows up, not necessarily as an organizing structure, but as a format that Fishman seems to have mixed feelings about. She seemed to wrestle with. Something that's discussed by Ulrike Müller in the interview with Fishman is the tension between the flow of paint and the ordered rule of the grids and structures that can't contain Fishman's misbehaving marks. I adore this piece of gridded notebook paper with different configurations of dots with descriptions like powerful dots confined to a square and two linear circles bursting out of their confines. Fishman's mark making both works within and yet pushes against the limits of the very material foundations of a drawing and painting practice, the paper and by extension, the canvas. She's insisting on the grid as a space for these marks to act out. While Fishman's paintings are often boldly gestural, those expressive marks always seem to vibrate in tension with their supports and exceed the lines of her drawn geometric configurations. We get the sense of working with those structures that were not made for you, but within which you make space nonetheless. Gestural abstraction is also not a strategy I write much about, but Jill Cassad's essay in the catalog contributes an understanding of Fishman's practice as a performative and deformative strategy of queer expressivity that risks an excessive vulnerability, wrestling with both her personal relations and a genealogy of abstract expressionist mastery, with singular loss and the global rage-inducing losses of queer and Jewish and feminist life. So if we take the artist's expression as something personal within a specific life world, we should also take seriously that it expresses something larger beyond that immediate context, that it keeps working on us, like those formal strategies we have a perverse attachment to, like the grid. Fishman says in her interview with Mueller, everything is a grid. I think of her grids as things to be alive inside, going back to that Every Ocean Hughes quote about structures we can be alive inside. What would normally impose a strict limiting order becomes a configuration that sustains Fishman's intimate gestures, forming the architectures for the dialogues and exchanges that would sustain her. Fishman's work asserts that a grid could chart a space for mischievous mark making, that a grid could be a grogger. It refers to the noise-making object used on the Jewish holiday of Purim, something that rattles and shakes us, that a grid could unfold a life of loves and losses. Positioned on the fragile and porous substrates of paper, Fishman's grid suggests her own movement in and against and beyond those structures that tried to confine her, structures of historical erasure that still press us against its margins. That all of this can be encompassed by her marks on these pages might seem doubtful to some listeners and readers. This gets at one of the major irresolvable tensions at the core of my project. My reading of these forms as queer tactics depend on a particular sensibility and attention to qualities that not every viewer will bring to the work. Queer abstraction does not offer a universally recognizable queerness that we could locate with any stability. So in writing about this work, I've risked a slippery analysis that might not stick. And I've also risked describing work that resists our efforts to describe it, works that resist interpretation. Queer abstraction is an ongoing reckoning with that which is unrepresentable. We still don't have many of the tools to make legible our gender and sexual revolts. And these abstractions show that we can never really have such languages or looks in representational terms. What we have as in Fishman's work, is a remainder of activating, sometimes devastating, and often queerly excessive gestures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lex. I'm clapping. I'm sure other folks are too.
I hear it. I sense it. Yeah.
It's difficult in the Zoom space. I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna go through questions that are in chat, which are really terrific. You can post them to everyone, you can send them to me. And I have so many thoughts, and I'm just so excited to hold your book in my hands when it comes out this fall.
Me too.
Take it as a guide through museums. I really love when you really analyze a work and pay such close attention to it and to its effects. And one question I had, just to start us off, and then I'm going to turn to audience questions as well, is how often surprising and rewarding an artist's attention to form can be. You can't often, and often the artist is the best source, for those kinds of conversations. Like there's a section in Louise's exhibition on curves, and I wouldn't have known that she started making curves because of Duccio's Maestà, for instance, that she had seen it in 1979, I think. And, these kinds of references that are embedded in work that, because it's abstract or because it's so gestural, for instance, with Louise, are quite surprising and generative in ways that I wouldn't have thought of. So maybe that's an invitation to talk about the role of conversations with artists when you're analyzing the work. It's also an invitation to talk about, and maybe to the other chapters or formal processes in your book, and what's, I don't know, what's been sort of surprising for you, or
Yeah, so having conversations with artists and visiting artist studios has become, it's such a marvelous gift that I've been given, in not most of the instances, most of the artists whose works, are featured. I have not had that opportunity, but a few I have. And it is very generous. I'm someone who I am really interested in process. And that is met with varying degrees of excitement to explain how something was made, to perhaps a bit of annoyance about about like my kind of obsession with like how something is made. And of course, I'm always analyzing the final work that we see, but I do want to know how Brody got those enamels in the wall, and I want to know whether something, how it was applied, whether it was poured. And part of that has to do with my endless fascination with materiality. And so I'm interested in how materials are being deployed and applied to get to that final work. So yes. And then, I guess I can tell you a little bit about, the full book. So I have chapters dedicated to particular formal strategies. And so I have and sort of forms that are like overloaded with baggage. So the hard edge and the grid are two chapters. There's a chapter on flaming color. There is a chapter on spatial tactics and installation work that uses everyday ready-made materials, sometimes referencing crafts, sometimes more kind of ready-made and things like that, but thinking about more kind of spatial and sculptural practices. And the epilogue is about the rainbow flag as a sign. Mm-hmm. And so, and how that kind of puts in tension a lot of the ways that I want to think about abstraction. So I don't shy away from the ways that my arguments might. I don't shy away from things that press up against my argument, right? Or like challenge the way that I want to think about abstraction. I just kind of that's all in there, or that's worked in to how I analyze the work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we've got a couple of really great questions. I know Amy Silman may have to step out, so I'm gonna ask Amy Silman's question, which is, I have a question about the ideas that have been expressed here and ascribed to queerness, but I'm wondering how you would talk about these same qualities if they were made by non-queer artists. I know you have a good response. For example, much of what I think is cool about the queer tactics that Lancaster has described are also present in work by Imi Noble, Richard Tuttle, or Blinky Palermo. Where is the non-normativity located exactly if the same qualities are part of the history of normative abstraction? And then, really what the stakes, what if the whole point of great abstraction is to destabilize boundaries, to wreck binaries, and to make us question any hierarchy between form and content.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yes, so that is a pretty crucial question. So you absolutely could take some of the ways that I'm, sort of describing these fugitive process of dragging, and you can absolutely see them in work that is made by artists who are not queer. Part of what I guess there are a couple of thoughts about that. Part of what I wanted to show too, and creating these kinds of conversations that are really already there between a contemporary queer artists and artists whose work maybe embodies more forms of modernism that we perceive as kind of stodgy or what have you in various ways, is to show how that, like, through this kind of transhistorical exchange, we can also see how that other work that's not made by contemporary queer artists is also can do this kind of queer fugitive work. That's absolutely the case. For me, one of the motivating questions was about why are politically engaged artists, certainly centrally queer artists, why are these artists interested in abstraction? But the answer to that didn't come in the form of like interviewing the artist about their life and how they came to abstraction, right? The way that I try to answer that question is by investigating and sort of trying to forge and investigate these queer formalist, materialist ways of approaching that work. I think that we can we can certainly talk more broadly about abstraction as a political strategy, and the degree to which you attach it to a particular artist who belongs to a particular community or identity really just depends on the approach that you want to take. But those are kind of that was just my approach. But yeah, I would say the question of why are these tactics useful for artists who are politically invested was the motivating issue.
Yeah, abstraction opens the possibility, right, in the first place, and then who has particular investments and reading that in the way that you do. Got another really great question from Angela Ting. I'm interested in hearing more about the hopefully generative tension between queerness theorized as excess and maximalism in terms of camp, drag, etc., and queer minimalism as a whittling down of form, a centralized form, so to speak. Do you find this to be a productive tension, or is there no tension at all in your view?
No, I think there definitely is. I think maybe the way that I've approached that, and now I'm going to want to like think more about that because that's really interesting. I think part of what I end up showing is like, here are strategies we associate with minimalism, that we see as like very austere and very whittled down. And part of how I think some of that queering happens is, I'm perhaps a little bit more heavy on the excess. That's, kind of where my analysis went. So, taking something that perhaps does seem very minimal and kind of exploding it in some way, or like kind of taking it like way over the top. But it's also the case that I am interested. I mean, looking at like Brody's work, there are these very, if you encounter the object in a gallery space, I mean, it's very minimalist. I mean, and some more than others, but seems very understated and very, so I think there is a tension, and I see both. Like I see like there's something very queer about like the very small and the very delicate, and then there's something very queer about like the, you know, sort of big over the top gestures. Yeah, that's what I have for now. But I think it's interesting. I don't think I thought of them necessarily in tension, but I think that that's might be another really generative way to think about, especially if we're thinking about practices kind of in conversation. That's very generative and interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know Angela, I think, is going to be at a workshop tomorrow. Thanks, Angela, for that question. Yeah, there's no, you're not, this project isn't, you know, defining queer art or one kind of queer, you know, practice, or no, right? Just to be really the opposite of, right, of, um, of what's going on. And yeah, Linda Bessemer is typing a comment more. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. I can only see,
Oh,
I
sure.
can't see the chat.
Just saying, backing up what you're saying, you know, critical reception of Jackson Pollock's work varied widely. For instance, Greenberg thought it was absolutely apolitical, yet Meyer Shapiro saw it as representation of Marxist non-alienated labor. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of unsettlement and, you know, interpretations of abstraction, which is part of the strength, and it still able to really position this under this umbrella of work that you're considering. Yeah. Maybe, are there any more questions folks want to put in chat? Maybe one more. I really appreciated your attention to Louise, and actually I was and thinking about her work in relation to your book and your research. I was writing a question about gesture and whether interpreting gesture would be harder, more subjective, more and you went right there, and I appreciate that very much. All right. And yes, Linda Bessemer asks, could you speak more about the affective tactile in peer strategies, in queer strategies? Affective and tactile, I think.
Yeah, that's my whole jam. So yeah, like materiality and tactility is a preoccupation, let's say. And I was really, you know, my thinking so indebted to so many queer theorists, but thinking, you know, Eve Sedgwick, touching feeling, thinking with affect in relation to materiality has been really important because you know, I think that's one of the ways that we can find into abstract work, right? And I think it's also one of the ways that we can think about sensuality in connection with those queer sensibilities, right? And the relation to, you know, I do think, you know, when I started looking at abstract work being produced by queer artists, this like touchy-feely, like I want to hold it. There's like this certain draw for me that may be there for everyone with any kind of you know tactile art, and I mean, but all the more reason to take the work of queer artists seriously for their formal and material engagement, right? That we don't just say like, okay, it's only queer, but because it was produced by a queer artist, and or abstraction is only interesting in the work of queer artists when we're talking about in these particular ways, right? But yeah, I think that that's really important to how the work works on us, right? Or how the work like works us, and through these kind of really this like certain thickness of matter and this interest in tactility and sensual engagement. I think that that's part of how that's so an important part of how it works on us. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Are you up for more conversation or yeah?
If there's more questions.
Okay. Yeah, just a couple of things. My colleague Brett Kaplan, who will also be with us tomorrow morning, can you say more about Louise's work's relationship with other queer abstractions, which has my mind sort of rolling. So yeah, Brett's asking about Louise Fishman's work, who's on screen now, and just being in conversation with Lex through reading your work and tonight with this talk has me really thinking about even more about queerness and abstraction in Louise's work. And the exhibition that's absolutely informed by process, not just so that we can chart her attention to process through time. Here's a curve from 1985 and a curve from 1995 and a curve from 2016, although that's absolutely, kind of beautiful and valuable to see, but how process is doing things over time and enacting things. And it's also particular abstractions like here, a Gregor for Ava and Agnes, or Leftover Colors are really attached to Louise's biography, but in a way that's not necessarily straightforward. She was a storyteller and really it was important that she told her attachment to other women artists, or yeah, any artists for that matter, the artists that really mattered to her in the past through her mark making and her gesture. So yeah.
I think that's something that that I saw too in the work that you put in the show, and that I started to kind of think with. I love this, like, so many dedications, right, to loves and to other artists and conversations, with other artists. It's, here made really explicit by the title, but is there in so much of her work. I think that, somebody could very easily, there could be can write the book on, like, here's the queer genealogy, of abstraction, and or like a genealogy. There is no the genealogy. That's not a thing, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, her, relationship to and her conversations with Harmony Hammond, part of what was so important for me with this project is to, like, because I do think of, when I think of, if there's a legacy, it's so indebted to the work of lesbian feminist artists who were forging their path through abstraction and through the thickness of this, white cis straight male dominated field, when you're, expected to transparently represent yourself as other in your work. And so I think that, generationally, we owe her so much, and that generation of artists so much. And I think that it may be the case that now we can kind of see that work in a new light, to see it in relation to these more recent practices, to see how crucial that intervention really was, and why it's still crucial now, and why it's still an important gesture. And
yeah, it really makes us rethink what might appear as historical, or those other practices. Okay, one more question, great question from Angela Ting, which kind of builds on what you were just saying, which is, can you speak more about the relationship between performativity and abstraction? For example, I think of Black abstractionist Frank Bowling, who in his essay, It's Not Enough to Say Black is Beautiful, likens Black abstraction to a cakewalk. That's a dance originated from the enslaved around the white art world. So cakewalking around the white art world. In other words, how do queer abstractionists play and perform around, in, with, against a straight white art world?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think, the concept of performativity is pretty central. I think about it, the way that I analyze the work, it's more about like how our forms and materials and processes performing, like how does the work perform in these ways? And like how does it activate, but there is that kind of like in wrestling with not just the tension in this kind of loaded, overloaded histories of these forms and what they have done and what they can do. There's also the overloaded, like, the straight white male art world and having to kind of navigate that. So, yeah, I mean, I think there are so many ways, like, I mean, perhaps, there are answers to that question that would have to like engage with certain like specific artists or specific groups of artists in different ways, right? Depending on your positionality and how you navigate that is going to be different. I think for me that is also part of why I was interested in these like forms that have these loaded histories and have this attachment to what we view of as this like universal history of abstraction, which is code for white and male, right? And how do we like take those forms that have those associations and like make it clear how imbricated they are with race and gender and sexuality, and I mean, the forms are all like, they're already kind of laden with those associations. And I think sometimes playing with them and reusing them in the ways that contemporary artists are, like part of what that abstract drag does is it like brings that violence to the surface. And how that happens varies depending on the work. Sometimes it's in really obvious ways and sometimes it's in more covert ways. But yeah, but I think that the way that performativity functions could apply absolutely to how artists are maneuvering themselves and also how the works are performing.
I think, yeah, too, a lot of your thinking and this work can help look at, some of those exhibitions in the late 1960s and 1970s where Frank Bowling's not being shown, because Black artists are supposed to be doing something else, or, and, there's a lot of that good work happening now too. But yeah, that's a great question, because the sort of social positioning and power isn't always, it's very real. It's not also abstract. So. Great. Well, thank you everyone for your questions and for your engagement this evening and for tuning in. Really appreciate seeing so many great folks here. And yeah, the conversation will continue here tomorrow in person with Illinois faculty and students. And yeah, this talk will be posted online as part of the exhibition archive, which I'm so grateful for. So Lex, thank you so much for your thinking and gorgeous writing about this work and helping us make sense of really difficult, challenging work. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming.